Welcome to the Get in the Fight podcast. My name is Nate Whitson, and I'm the founder of Get in the Fight Ministries and our exclusive online fight club for Christian men. Everything we do here is dedicated to helping Christian men become the men that God meant for them to be. So if you're looking for helpful content and conversations that can help you to grow and become the man that God made you to be, then you're in the right place. But before we get started, please do me a huge favor and be sure to subscribe, click the like button, and then leave us a 5-star review. Doing that helps us to reach more men who are looking for content just like this. Also, if you'd like to learn more about our mission and how to get involved or how to join the Fight Club, then head on over to getinthefight.club. That's getinthefight.club and learn more today. But without further ado, it's time to get in the fight. So let's go. Hey guys, welcome to the Get in the Fight podcast. I'm your host, Nate Whitson. Thank you for listening. If you're a Christian man, this is really intended for you. This is to help you and me, help all of us to live bigger and better lives, to become the men that God meant for us to be. And so as you listen to this today, if this is something that really speaks to you and you really feel like this is something worth sharing, or maybe there's other people that you know that could benefit from this, then do me a favor and simply share the URL. Maybe post it to your social media accounts or just text it to a friend, whatever it is, if you think it's worthy of that. And especially when you subscribe and comment or like on it, it really just tells whatever platform you're listening to that this is worthwhile, and it helps us to reach more men. So certainly appreciate you being here. I want to present information that is helpful in that fight to be a better man. And that's really what this is geared towards. And I think today's conversation is one of those that is worth a conversation. It is worth maybe slowing down and considering. And today we're talking about suffering, learning from suffering in particular. You know, you think about suffering and think about the reasons why. Why do we suffer the things that we do? Why does God allow suffering, and what can we do about it? Those are some of the things that I want to talk about today. And so again, thanks for being here. I hope that this is something worth your while. I've been reading through a book here. In fact, I'll show it for those of you watching on the YouTube channel. The Man in the Mirror, Solving the 24 Problems That Men Face. It's excellent. It's a 25th anniversary book. It's been around forever because it's just loaded with information. And so I'll put a link to this in the show notes as well. I highly recommend it. Again, The Man in the Mirror by Patrick Morley. I want to use some of his thoughts from chapter 20 of his book, where he really kind of lays out this conversation so well. And so just know, if you have read that, if you're reading through it, you might go, God, this guy's just plagiarizing the whole thing. Well, I'm totally stealing the ideas, but I'm also I want to put my spin on it as well. I want to give you those thoughts. And if you've listened to enough of the podcast here on the Get in the Fight podcast, you know that I'm an avid reader. I believe that growing in wisdom is just a critical part of being a better man, understanding the world around us, understanding how to have influence and impact in the areas where God has called you to lead and to grow. And so anyways, I love to read, but what I find and what statistics show is that very few men do. And so when I read a great book or read portions of it that I think are worth sharing, that's what I'm going to do. So again, read the book, The Man in the Mirror. Highly encourage it. But we're going to jump right into his conversation and some of his thoughts and some of mine when it comes to suffering. What can we learn from suffering? So first thing first, 1 Thessalonians 3:23 says this: We sent Timothy, who is our brother and co-worker in God's service in spreading the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you in your faith, so that no one would be unsettled by these trials, for you know quite well that we are destined for them. You know, in days of old, to be a follower of Jesus, especially at this time, was to know quite well that you were destined to suffer. There was no question about suffering in those days. There was no avoiding suffering in those days. Today, you know, as a flip side to that idea, we have lived here in the States in particular for, you know, quite a while. We've lived in a really weird historical bubble where we haven't suffered like men of old. We haven't had to put on the painful marks both in our psyche or on our bodies of those who have come before us, who have suffered immensely for following Jesus. And I think we all know that we're in a new era. We're in a new time where darkness is certainly spreading quickly. And to carry the name of Jesus, I think will carry more of the marks of history where we will suffer. And we should probably, like we are being exhorted in 1 Thessalonians, know quite well that we are destined for a certain amount of suffering. Now, suffering, when you read the New Testament, would be one of those things where you would think, well, yeah, don't be surprised by this at all. In fact, here's how to follow Jesus in the midst of suffering. That's really what a lot of the writers are talking about. In our world today, though, we do everything we can to avoid any kind of semblance of suffering or pain, right? I mean, we like our house exactly the temperature it needs to always be. And maybe I'm just speaking for me in these things, but I don't like being too hot. I don't like being too cold. I don't like the discomfort and pain of, all kinds of things in life. And so we really shelter ourselves from suffering and from pain. But life is a struggle. We know this, right? As much as we try to avoid it, we know that life is painful, that suffering and struggle and hardship is a part of not just the Christian walk, but just life itself. This life, it will not live forever. You will not live in this body forever. It wasn't destined for it. It is corruptible. It's dying. There is an end date to it. And so we, in the middle of this, simply try to make our lives as comfort and carefree as we can. But life is a struggle, despite our desire to live a good life and avoid pain. We should not necessarily want to suffer. This is not kind of what I'm not saying that you should want to or invite suffering. But in today's conversation, I hope that we learn not to be surprised by it. It is one of those things that, we often talk about with our girls. So we have 4 girls in our house, and it's one of those things where I think sometimes, gosh, I hope we're not talking about it too much. And yet, even in this conversation here, as I say it out loud, I think, no, I don't think we're talking about it too much. We want our kids to be prepared to say, following Jesus will mean a level of suffering. Living just this life alone will be an amount of suffering. You will lose loved ones. You will go through trials. There will be pain. And so preparing them for that is preparing them for what we think is real life. Again, going back to 1 Thessalonians, you know quite well that you are destined for them because that is life. Suffering then, and I think this is kind of a part of where I want to go with this today, suffering is a part of life. And the only decision that you get to make regarding suffering is whether or not you will suffer with Christ or without him. Think about that. You cannot fully avoid suffering, pain, trials, hardships. What you get to decide, though, is whether or not you will suffer with Christ or without him. Listen to this verse from 1 Peter 4:12 and 13. Dear friends, do not be surprised. Here it is again. Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. There's a ton there in 1 Peter 4:12 and 13. But the thing that I want to focus on here is suffering with or without Christ. Dear friends, listening to this podcast now, dear friends listening to this, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised as if something strange were happening to you, as if like suffering was, wow, maybe the Lord is against me. Maybe God is causing this to just bring me pain. And we'll talk about some of the reasons here in just a minute that we do suffer. But don't be surprised. In fact, I think many times one of the ways that the devil discourages men is that when they go through painful trials, when they go through suffering, rather than rejoicing in it, in as much as you're participating in the sufferings of Christ, that 1 Peter says here, rather than being overjoyed by the glory that is to come, we look at suffering as if maybe we've done something wrong. There's this like idea that carries from ancient days that if you suffer, it's because you've done something bad. It's because you've done something wrong. And yet, what we're trying to consider today is that we know quite well that we're destined for this in this life. There will be suffering. So, my friends, don't be surprised. We're not supposed to be surprised, but we do wonder. When we suffer, we wonder, does God even care? When you're going through suffering that just has seemingly no end, you think, does he even know that I'm hurting? Does he care that I'm hurting? Why won't God answer me? Why won't God help me? Where is God in this? And this is where the devil really starts to play games with us when it comes to suffering. We know from Scripture that we shouldn't be surprised. But I think when we deal with long-term suffering, when we deal with things that aren't going to be fixed, we can start to doubt and to wonder. And this is where that challenge comes. Will you suffer with Christ or without him? Will you bring him in to your suffering? So we'll talk about some of these things here at the end when we talk about some things that I think we can learn from suffering. But I thought it would be helpful. And again, looking at the book that Patrick wrote, he lays out 7 reasons that men suffer. And I think this is worth us considering. Hopefully this is helpful for you as you think about this. Not all suffering comes from the same sources. So quickly looking at these, here's the first one. Some suffering comes from innocent mistakes. This is where nobody has done anything wrong, but you are suffering anyways. It's just part of life, right? Have you ever suffered for innocent mistakes that you've made? Right? Probably so. Things like you've screwed up, but it was an innocent mistake. It wasn't like you were trying to cause trouble, but you did. You screwed up, you messed up. It was innocent, and yet suffering is still a part of that journey, right? There was a time back when I was, I wish I could think of the age, probably, I don't know, 5th, 6th grade, 7th grade maybe. We were helping to be managers of the high school football program, me and some friends. And I lost one of the assistant coach's keys, and I have no idea where. It could be literally anywhere between the school and several fields that we had to walk across to get to where practice was. And it was just super embarrassing. Again, you don't want to be noticed as this young guy. I was already, I didn't want the center of attention, certainly not for that reason when coach was ticked at me. And the whole team is fanning out on a search party kind of thing, lining up as wide as we can, and everybody's looking for the keys that this young Nate Whitson lost somewhere. And I do think we found them, but gosh, I just remember feeling like an inch tall. So embarrassed. I suffered embarrassment for sure because of an innocent mistake. And so sometimes that's why we suffer, right? There's just times that you suffer. You didn't mean to do anything wrong, but bad things happen there. Mistakes were made and suffering ensues. So that is one of the reasons that we suffer. Number 2 is an error in judgment. This is where there might have been a guideline or a rule that had you followed it, it could have saved you from suffering, right? Had you just obeyed the law or followed the rule, if you would have stayed in the lines, then you would have been fine. But when there was an error of judgment on your part, it caused you to suffer, right? Innocent or not, you will still suffer when you make an error in judgment. I remember one time probably just got my driver's license, probably 16, 17 years old. And I wasn't drag racing, genuinely. I wasn't, but I'm sure the way it looked was, here's a young, stupid kid who's lining up next to another car to drag race against it, because we did pull out fast. But there was a police officer, and I come from a small town where there's one police officer. So the one police officer happens to see us pull out of this parking lot side by side, and I pull in to, get in front of the car, but, he pulls me over. So, of course, I'm scared to death here. And, what I learned from it, in essence, was that there was an error in judgment. So I get pulled over. People are seeing that the police is pulling me over. Again, small town, total embarrassment here. Nothing really crazy came of that other than, again, just more embarrassment, more shame, more suffering in some way, right? Because more pain because of an error in judgment. Should I have done that? No. And point well taken. So are there things in your life that you have suffered for because of an error in judgment. You broke a rule, you broke a law, you did something you weren't supposed to, and there were consequences or pain. Absolutely, right? This is just part of life, but it's one of the reasons that we suffer. Number one was innocent mistakes. Number two, error in judgment. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the show so far, and if you are, please do me a big favor and simply get engaged in a simple way. For you, that might be clicking the like button or maybe subscribing to the show. For others, it may be commenting on a show that really stands out to them, or maybe it's just copying the URL and texting it to a friend or pasting that into your social media, whatever it is. All of those things make a huge difference for us, and it helps us to reach more Christian men who are trying to live bigger and better lives. So, number one, thank you for being a listener, and thank you for being a part of this community and part of this show. We appreciate it more than you know, and we appreciate you getting engaged and helping us out. Thanks so much. Now back to the show. Number three, Patrick talks about an integrity issue. This is where dishonesty or a lack of integrity can cause men to suffer. So this is one where you might say, have you ever lied and got caught in the lie, right? I wrote down the story of, there was a time where I was a freshman in high school, I think. Freshman, sophomore, I don't know. I had just gotten my license, so whenever that would have been. And I had a girlfriend that lived in the Detroit area, and I wanted to go see her. But the bummer was that there was a track meet on that Saturday. So I lied about being sick. I skipped the meet. I bailed out on my teammates, and I went to see this girl. And then I had to go face my track coach, who's also my football coach, who's also like my second father. And it didn't go well. Although I will say, looking back at that story, I'll have to talk to him about this sometime. But I do remember thinking I was going to get the hammer. Like, he had a bit of a fiery side to him back in the day, a little Greek fire to this guy, and just amazing guy. But yeah, when he was ready to hammer you, he could hammer you. And I was expecting it. I thought it was going to be that. And I think he just was probably kind of chuckling to himself, maybe a little bit like, you dummy. Don't. And he basically said, don't ever do it again. And I didn't. I did not do that again, but I did suffer some because I had an integrity issue. I'd lied about something thinking I could get away with it. I mean, how stupid is that, right? And then had to suffer the consequence. So maybe for you, think about it. Are there any stories in your life where there have been consequences or pain, things that you've suffered because you had an integrity issue? Now, obviously, in all of these stories, innocent mistakes, right? Error in judgment, integrity issues, all of those could end up with very serious consequences. All of those could end up being things where an error in judgment for some people is they leave a party, drinking too much, and they kill somebody and they're in prison the rest of their life, and they have to live with that fact. An integrity issue is somebody thought they could steal something from their employer and it bites them, and they didn't consider how serious this thing could be, right? So, I'm kind of telling you some stories of mine that are lighter, embarrassing maybe, suffering to a smaller degree. But there are many of these stories where errors in judgment, integrity issues have led to vastly different stories, right? Number 4, 7 reasons that men suffer. Number 4 is life happens, right? Sometimes you're just minding your business and life just happens. Murphy shows up where bad things, if they could happen, they're going to happen. And just, we suffer because life is that way. We have friends of ours who, I remember babysitting for this kid years ago, but he fell down some stairs when he was a little boy, from what I understand of this story, and it caused some brain damage, and he's never been able to fully function as a normal child, and now he's an adult, but needs care all of his life because of a reason where there's no good reason. It's just life happens. Things like this happens. It's a broken world, and we suffer because sometimes things like that just happen, right? Friends of ours that we know that have a child who has a rare disease, and they suffer as they watch her slowly die day after day, right? It's just this terrible suffering, this terrible pain, and it's nobody's fault. It's literally just a piece of this broken world where sin was entered in and the fallout of it continues on, right? Sometimes we're minding our own business and life just happens, right? So we suffer sometimes for those reasons. Number 5 is we suffer because evil exists. Evil absolutely exists, and unfair things happen to all of us, right? Do you remember where you were, for example, on 9/11? Do you remember watching the news that day? Do you remember all the details? I bet you do. I remember exactly where I was in Virginia. I was a bachelor still. I was living in a house with some friends in Virginia. I actually had gotten up that morning and was doing a verse-by-verse study through the book of Romans, and didn't have any TV on, didn't have any news on. Driving into work, all of a sudden I turned the radio on, and it's the first notice of like, wow, something big happened. And I go into town. My friend was an athletic trainer at Liberty University, and get in there, everybody's surrounding the TVs, and again, that everything changed, right? Everything changed 9/11. It's one of those things where you go, I'll never forget it, right? Evil exists. School shootings, mass murders, rapists, child pedophiles. I mean, we don't need to like list out every single kind of crazy, but we understand that there is absolute evil in this world. I've listened to many Navy SEALs, Special Force guys talking about how their goal, now that they've seen evil face to face, one of the motivating factors for them is to keep it off of our soil, to keep it away from our country, to keep it away from here, because they've seen evil face to face. And it's one of those things that when you hear them tell their stories, there is just no doubt that evil exists. And because of that, people suffer. Number 6 is discipline from God. Sometimes we suffer because God, in his grace, disciplines us like a father, right? Sometimes we can fool other people, but God sees it all. He sees what we do, and sometimes we need the discipline of God. There's a story of a guy that's in our fight club who tells the story of having an addiction, a sex addiction, pornography problem for many, many years. And he describes the story of where he had to be broken, in his own words, by God's grace, right? He needed, in other words, to suffer the discipline of God in order to be made whole, in order to get free, in order to move forward. But along the way, because of the addiction, because of the struggle, he suffered. His family suffered. He thought he would lose everything. And there's so many of these stories, right? We suffer because we deserve the discipline of God, and God in his grace and mercy will discipline us like a father who loves his children, right? But it hurts. It hurts. We suffer. The consequences, the pain that comes with discipline is no fun, right? But it's one of the reasons that we suffer. The last one here, number 7, is just that sometimes God tests us, right? There's discipline from God, and then sometimes there's testing, right? Where God tests your character in order to grow it or to see where it's at. Think about like Abraham being told to sacrifice his only son, or Job, where we see that God was testing him because the devil's like, yeah, but you've surrounded him with good things. Of course he's going to love you, right? Test him and see. What if you took away everything? And God allows that to happen. So here's the thing that I struggle with discipline and with God's testing is, how do you know, right? Will you always know whether the trial or the suffering or the pain that you're going through is a test or not? I don't think so. But we can be sure that there are times that when you're suffering, what you're going through is from him. It makes me think of the story where Jesus, when he begins this ministry, right, he has this amazing moment where his father literally speaks audibly from heaven and says, "This is my boy. This is my son. I'm so proud of you," right? Everything a man needs to hear from his father at some point. I'm so proud of you. You've got what it takes, right? He goes from this moment of "this is my son" into 40 days of the wilderness. And it says in the scriptures that the Spirit led him to the wilderness. In other words, God brought him to this place, right? Where there was testing, where there was suffering, where there was pain. Will you always know whether God's testing you or disciplining you? Maybe not. But remember this, suffering is a part of life. And the only decision that we've talked about so far, the only decision that you have to make when it comes to suffering is whether or not you will suffer with Christ or without him. There is no avoiding suffering. It's not possible this side of heaven. In fact, here's what happens when we do try to avoid it. When you try to avoid any kind of suffering or pain, guess what happens? We end up avoiding learning. And this is why I call this learning from suffering. There are things that suffering and pain can teach you that nothing else can, right? And when you have men who are on the sidelines and just say, I want to feel nothing. I don't want to feel any of the pain. I don't want any of the suffering. I don't have to deal with the heartache. What you do is you avoid learning the lessons that God had from suffering, right? So there's 7 reasons that we just went through, different reasons, because I think it's helpful to understand that suffering is here. It's a part of this world, but it could be for all kinds of different reasons. Innocent mistakes, right? Just lack of judgment in a moment that causes pain. It could be discipline. It could be testing. It could be all these things. But what we know is that you will suffer. And in fact, we go back to the original verse saying, count on it, right? Don't be surprised by it. You know quite well that in this life you are destined to suffer. And so we want to embrace the lessons, right? Like we don't, again, want to pursue any more suffering than we have to. Life will give you what it's going to give you. As men who are trying to live bigger and better lives, what I'm suggesting we do is learn from the pain, learn from the suffering, and have a mindset before the suffering starts that says, I'm not surprised of this. I'm going to look for the lessons in it. I'm going to look to learn from it when it shows up. Will that be easier said than done? Of course. It's going to be tough, right? But you can suffer with Christ. You can learn with him, or you can try to avoid it and go on your own and see how that works out for you. That's really the 2 options when it comes to suffering. So what are we to learn from it? Here's just a couple verses that I thought could be helpful for us as we wrap up this conversation. James 1:2-4 says this, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. So let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Consider it joy. Now that sounds crazy, right? Like in the middle of this sounds crazy. But God says that when you consider the trials of many kinds, right? Could be for any of those 7 reasons. Whatever the source or the cause of the suffering is, consider it pure joy because it leads to somebody who lacks nothing. Well, how could that be? Well, when a man walks fully and completely and closely with the Lord and you are knit together in suffering, you have moved to a different level of relationship with God. Suffering and pain can bring you close to God in ways that nothing else can. You will lack nothing because nothing will be able to break through that relationship with God. If pain and suffering can't be used to do it and you make it through there with strength, you will have joy knowing that this is the worst it ever gets and God is always with me. There's a confidence and a peace and a joy, strangely enough, that can come from pain and from suffering. So we can learn to consider it, to think about it, to embrace it as pure joy because we know that the testing produces in us something that's valuable for eternity. Another thing that we can learn is Philippians 1:29, for it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. Think about this. It's been granted to you. It's been granted as a gift, right? If I'm going to grant you something, it's something positive that I want to give to you on behalf of myself or my family or something else, right? This something that you've been granted is on behalf of Christ. It's a gift that he's giving to us. And what is that? Not just to believe in him, which is a gift in itself, right? Nobody can come to the Father unless they're drawn to him by the Father, by the Spirit, right? Only God's grace and mercy to allow you to believe and to give you what it takes to believe. But it isn't just ending there. No, beyond belief is you also get to suffer for him. Now, that's a different mindset completely, isn't it? Even just to say it, to hear it that way is such a flip. It's such a twist on how we think of suffering. But you have been granted on behalf of Christ, not only to believe, but you've been granted the gift to also suffer for him. Philippians 1:29. That is certainly something for us to consider when we think about how do we turn it into pure joy? How do we look at testing and pain and suffering and all these trials as something good? Well, it's been granted to us as a gift from our Savior, who knows very well about what it means to suffer for the name of God, right? You have been granted this gift as well. It's something we can learn from suffering today. Last verse here, 2 Corinthians 12:9-10 says this, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses. I delight in insults. I delight in hardships, in persecutions, and I delight in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." What do we learn from suffering? Well, we learn to persevere in our faith, and we learn how to mature as men. You know, our Fight Club verse, 1 Corinthians 16:13-14 says, "Act like men." Well, that had to do with, in a lot of ways, maturing from a boy to a man. How does a boy mature from, in a progression of life, from adolescence to an adult, mature man? He goes through life. He goes through hard things. And over time, you persevere through that, and you become mature and wise and strong. It's same in the spiritual world, too. We learn to persevere when we embrace weakness. And I'm telling you, this is a tricky one for us as men. I don't ever want to show weakness. I hate crying still to this day. I'm fighting it back constantly. I'm watching American Idol with the kids the other day. And it's just these beautiful stories of kids winning, just doing great, telling some stories of just incredible things they've been through. And I'm like, goodness gracious, what is happening to me? Right? Like, I'm such a wimpy guy now, it seems. I don't want to show weakness like that. I want to be brave. I want to be tough. I want to be strong. I want to act like a man. And yet, what this is about is saying, I'm going to be made perfect in weakness. In my weakness, I get to boast because Christ's power rests on me. It becomes evident that this isn't because I'm strong, but because he is. So what can we learn from suffering? We can learn to be humble. We can learn to be mature. We can learn to have a perspective on life that isn't about us showing how strong and mighty and great we are as men, but how amazing and powerful and strong God is, that he could create joy in the midst of pain and suffering, that God could grant us the ability to suffer for him and advance his cause, and we will rejoice with him forever and ever when we meet with him and he returns, right? When we're weak, then we're strong. It's such a flip of the script, right? We learn to suffer like Jesus, and in so doing, we become more like him, right? There's nothing more powerful as a teacher than pain. We learn from suffering that God's grace is truly enough. We learn that grace is sufficient, right? We will try everything we can in our own strength to get through those things. We turn to every other thing, but what we find is that his grace is sufficient. He never leaves us. We make it through. We persevere. It sometimes is sloppy. It sometimes is messy. It sometimes will be up and down, and you'll feel like you're just losing your mind. But when you come through it, you will see that God's grace held you there. His grace, his power was enough to get you through. We learn that our weakness displays his greatness, and our weakness becomes a tool for his glory. So we can learn all of these things. So listen to this last verse, First Peter 5:10 then. And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. Suffering cannot be avoided, but Jesus' life and death and resurrection tells us something very important about suffering, and that is that we have hope. Suffering teaches us, we learn from it to have hope. This suffering will not last. Again, after you've suffered for a little while, he himself will restore you. Think about that day that is to come. Think about the eternal perspective. This suffering will not last here. This is as bad as it will ever get for you, Christian man. This is the worst it will get. God will restore you himself. He will make you strong, firm, and steadfast. We can trust him and we can put our hope in him. That suffering, for whatever of those 7 reasons that we suffer, suffering will not be the final story. You know, if you want to be a man that God meant for you to be, if you want to play that role, then let the pain of suffering teach you some things. Let it teach you how to find joy in the midst of it. Let it teach you perseverance. Let it teach you how to finish strong. Let it teach you to suffer for him because his cause is bigger than your comfort. Let it teach you about his power and grace. Let it teach you how to persevere and mature. Let it teach you how to be more like Jesus in his suffering and be nearer to him, and let that be enough for you. Let his grace be sufficient in your life in all ways so that your weakness becomes a tool for his glory. Easier said than done. I'm preaching to myself here, trust me. But this is the path of greatness in God's kingdom. This is the path of getting in the fight, of being strong, of being firm, of being steadfast. We want all of those things, but guess what? The path is often through pain. You want to be strong. You want to be firm. You want to be steadfast in the Lord. You want to be the man that God meant for you to be. You want to get in the fight and win. Well, oftentimes that means persevering through pain and through suffering. So don't be surprised by it. Don't be surprised when the trials come. Instead, learn from the suffering. Learn from the pain. That's it for today, fellas. Listen, again, if you like this message, if you think this is helpful, would you share it with somebody? There's a lot of guys suffering for a lot of different reasons, right? Could be any of those 7 that we talked about today. But let them see that you have choices today, that they and you and me, we can either suffer with him or without him. And we want to, as godly men, suffer with him for his glory. And these are some things that we need to learn how to do together. So thanks for listening today. Go get in the fight, and we'll see you soon. Hey guys, thanks so much for being here today and listening to the show. Please be sure to head over to the website at getinthefight.club. And before you go, if you haven't already, please subscribe, click the like button, and leave us a positive 5-star review. It makes a huge difference whenever you do. Have a great day. Go get in the fight.